All right, finishing up the standard three notes. I know this says 3B, but it should say 3D. We're going to talk about the South and the West and this idea of westward expansion. And the Civil War is over, Reconstruction is over, and the United States begins to change its focus from fighting north-south, and now they're going to focus on getting out into the West. So probably the better of these two essential knowledge is this idea of assess the continuities and changes in the society of the West as diverse groups settled there between 1862 and 1924. And I think the first thing to note is the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad really combines the United States together. And we get that idea of a national marketplace that had started with the American system of Henry Clay trying to connect the country together. And now we get the Transcontinental Railroad and later more transcontinental railroads. The South had always been opposed to a transcontinental railroad because they didn't need it. They didn't want their tax money going there. So when the Southern states left Congress in 1860 as part of the Civil War, Lincoln and the congressional Republicans of the North decided that would be a perfect time to pass this law, and they passed a bill starting the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad. This is going to lead to a railroad boom overall. Creates a national marketplace that crisscrosses railroads throughout the entire country. And it leads to a railroad boom that's so big, it actually creates three new other industries tied into the railroad industry. First is steel. You need steel to make all of these railroad cars. You need coal to power the railroad, and the railroad is going to lead to this new coal industry. And lumber to make the ties that the steel beams sit on that crisscross the country. So three new gigantic industries, all from the railroad. It becomes the literal engine that drives the economy. This is a picture of Promontory Point, Utah, where you can see the golden spike was connecting those two trains together. We'll talk about more of that in a second. The important thing to note about all this, by the way, is that the federal government pays for it all, right? While these are private railroad companies, the federal government is giving land grants and other subsidies to pay for the railroad. Now, what does that mean to subsidize? It means they're giving money to pay for it. And a land grant is simply they gave land to the railroad in order to build the tracks. They typically gave a mile on either side of the railroad where they thought the railroad was going to be built, and the railroad company got to keep almost all of it. The railroad's going to make tons of money off of that by either building shops and renting them, or building homes and renting them, or just selling the land outright. So the federal government plays a huge role in this infrastructure improvement. It's called the Pacific Railway Act. That's the law that leads to the Transcontinental Railroad. It was passed during the Civil War. On the eastern side, from, say, St. Louis to the Rocky Mountains, that chunk is going to be created and built literally by old immigrants, those Germans and the Irish, and African Americans. It's going to be kind of that poor people that are moving into the West. On the western side, that from California towards the Rocky Mountains, it's going to be built by the Chinese, and they're working together, right? Mostly Chinese immigrants are working there. So you can see that immigrants are going to help make this national marketplace. In order to get people to move out there, because now that the railroad is out there, the farmers who hadn't settled there before because there's no good way to get their product to the market, they have a way to get their product now. They're going to use the railroads. But the government still needs to get people to move out there. So how do they encourage that movement? Well, they're literally going to subsidize mostly white folks to move into the West. They do this through two big laws. First is the Homestead Act in 1862. The land became free to any individual that moved out into the West, settled on the land, and made it productive, I think, in 7 years. So you see a lot of pictures like this where people are moving out there quickly, building out a very, very basic home, mostly out of mud and wattle, so that they can get farming quickly. The second was the land grants, the Morrill Land Grant College Act in 1862, and that gave free land to colleges moving into the West if they built agricultural or trade schools. So a lot of those trade schools like Texas A&M are going to become bigger colleges as they expand outward. Now, all this land is going to be taken from Native Americans, of course, and we're going to talk a little bit about how that happens here in a little bit. So we get this migratory stream of people moving into the West trying to look for economic opportunity. Sure, it might just be untamed wilderness, but if you get in early enough, you can get a big piece of land, you can make it farmer, you can become a farmer, become productive. It's this American platonic ideal of individual liberty, right? You're off on your own, you have freedom. It's also culturally exploitation of Native Americans and Hispanic Americans, especially in the Southwest. There are some African Americans that leave the South now. I know I said in the last video, most African Americans ended up right on the same land where they had been enslaved, but there is a group of African Americans that move out west called the Exodusters. And if you don't get that pun, it's a Bible pun. Exodus in the Bible is when the Jews fled their slavery in Egypt, and that book of Exodus is talking about their time out traveling in the wilderness. And now you have African Americans leaving slavery and traveling in the wilderness. Okay. All right. Let's talk about life in the West. This is cattle and cowboys. There is an increase in the size of urban areas, which is leading to an increase in the demand for beef. So cowboys would literally drive the cattle to the nearest rail line, which would then take it usually to Chicago, where the cattle would be slaughtered, put on refrigerated cars, and spread across the country. So large ranches, helped by barbed wire, are going to also increase the number of railroads, and the growing meatpacking industry does eventually need, it ends the need for large cattle drives, but you can kind of see that here. So the cowboys that are driving across country are no longer going to be needed, but they are going to become important ranchers. So important for our understanding of the West is the Indian Wars. Native Americans are unwilling to move in the face of encroaching settlers, of course. They'd already been pushed all the way out into Oklahoma, and now they're going to be pushed into smaller and smaller pieces of territory we're going to call reservations. Some Native Americans cooperated and some didn't. One extreme example of the problems that the Native Americans faced from the white settlers is the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864. In the Sand Creek Massacre, militia attacked a peaceful group of Colorado Native Americans who lied about the attack. The Sand Creek the Native American group had been invited by the governor of Colorado to come and stay at one of the forts, and while they're on the way there, militia had attacked those Native Americans and slaughtered them. When it went before a congressional committee, because there's a whistleblower among the troops said that they attacked in cold blood, they weren't being attacked themselves. Congress condemned the 165 Native American murders, but no one was held accountable because somehow the whistleblower was murdered. Convenient. So Native Americans are not going to be treated very well in this case. Other Native American groups are going to defend their territory, and troops that are fresh off the Civil War are going to be sent out into the West in order to attack Native Americans in what are called Indian Wars at the time. In order to facilitate this, Congress created a couple of African American regiments that were going to be used to fight out west against Native Americans. These soldiers were called Buffalo Soldiers. Not sure why. I probably could look it up, but I'm not going to take the time. Those Buffalo Soldiers were African American groups that were sent out to fight in the Indian Wars. The Native Americans are going to be relocated onto reservations. Eventually, those reservations are going to be taken as well. There are holdouts to the reservations. For example, the Sioux, which we're not going to call the Sioux, but I mentioned the term Sioux because it's going to be called the Great Sioux War, are going to fight Custer. Now, why don't we use the term Sioux? They prefer to be called Lakota. The Lakota and the Sioux are the same tribe, or the same group of people. But Sioux was a term that was given to them as almost a racial slur by other Native American groups. I believe it means something akin to the enemy. So they don't call themselves the Sioux, they call themselves the Lakota. So we're going to use the term that they use for themselves. Now, miners were starting to encroach on Lakota territory in the Black Hills up near South Dakota. And the miners want that land, so don't other white settlers. The chief of the Lakota, Sitting Bull, and his war leader, one of the war leaders, Crazy Horse, are going to lead the Lakota off their reservation to go and attack these people that are encroaching on their territory. The army sends in their forces, and the Lakota and the other tribes are going to fight against this the encroaching army. And this is what leads to the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. Notice this is the same year that Reconstruction ends. With the Battle of Little Bighorn, 210 American soldiers are going to move against the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho in their encampment, which had been combined together by Crazy Horse to fight against the army. They saw these these Lakota horsemen coming up over a ridge. The American army assumed that it was just a small scouting party, and they went to attack. And when they crossed the ridge, they go right into 2,500 warriors led by Crazy Horse. Custer and all of his soldiers are going to be killed. It becomes a huge rallying point in the Indian Wars for the Americans. This is going to lead to a total war against the Lakota and all their allies, which eventually forced the Lakotas to surrender by 1877. So while Battle of Little Bighorn didn't end well for Custer, the long-term consequences that Lakota are going to be decimated. There is some resistance to being pushed onto the reservations, even outside of fighting back physically. Part of the problem with the railroads was that the growth and demand for railroad and the demand for buffalo skins led to a demise of the buffalo. Those Plains Indians, which were living out on the plains and using the buffalo as their food source and their shelter source, actually, is going to be decimated by the Plains Indians. They're going to be forced to move into urban areas. They're going to their cultural ways are in decline to the point where by 1880s they're at a very low point. And in the 1880s, there was an effort to regain their cultural significance through trying to reconnect with their past, and it leads to something called the Ghost Dance movement. The Ghost Dance was a ritual. The white encroachment is going to be challenged. The problem is that for non-natives, the non-Plains Indians that were witnessing the Ghost Dance, they made assumptions that this was an effort to rally a war cry, right? There was some rumors that white folks believed that the Ghost Dance was an effort to by the Native Americans to become bulletproof. There's a belief that, so the white folks believed that Native Americans believed that it would make their shirts bulletproof, and then it would make them more fierce warriors. It may or may not be the case. Some people might have believed that, but the point is that because the white population was nervous about this potential uprising caused by our cultural reconnection, it's going to lead to the Massacre of Wounded Knee. So in December of 1890, what's left of the Lakota are going to meet at a place called Wounded Knee, South Dakota, and try to have one of these ghost dance meetings. There's a bit more to it, but this is the quick version. It's a 3-day thing. They're meeting, and they're going to be surrounded by American cavalry. The cavalry try to disarm some of the Lakota that are at this big camp meeting. Guns go off, and a scared cavalry that was surrounding the Native Americans attack and kill about 150 unarmed men, women, and children. They initially called it a battle, but this was not a battle. This was a massacre at Wounded Knee. The Massacre of Wounded Knee is often considered sort of the end of this revival for Native Americans. We're going to move into a transition of assimilation or attempted assimilation at this point. So just a recap: Indian removal into the Trail of Tears in the 1830s and 40s in Jackson, moving on to being forced onto reservations in the 50s and 1850s and 60s. The Indian Wars throughout the 70s and being moved onto smaller reservations. And then the white population wants even more than that. They want to force assimilation or force them to act similar to white folks. They're going to divide that reservation land into smaller and smaller homesteads, right? Small acres of individual plots. So rather than living on the land as a unit, the tribes and the cultural groups are going to be forced to live as individuals, as white folks. They were calling this kill the Indian but save the man, right? Get rid of their native culture in order to save the person and not have to kill them. So they're going to try to take the land, and then when they're unable to farm the land as a white settler, they're just going to give the land to white settlers. Even worse than this, many of the Native Americans are going to have their children taken away and be forced to go live in mostly Eastern schools that are going to teach them how to act in the white manner. So in the this is going to last from about the 1880s, this Dawes Severalty Act, to about 1924 when the Indian Citizenship Act is passed. And this is great. The Native Americans finally get the 14th Amendment protections. Hey, but it's just a way to force assimilation. Boo. And it doesn't protect their natural rights whatsoever. Also boo. And it's around this time we see what's called the end of the frontier. A guy named Frederick Jackson Turner, who is a historian, argued that what made America great was that there was always a frontier that the United States could move into. That whenever any cultural group or anybody was feeling too much pressure, they could move into the West and they could explore the wild, vast wilderness. And this made America great because there's always potential room to grow and expand and find new resources. And Frederick Jackson Turner says that in his frontier thesis, that there's no more room to expand. The frontier is closed. The United States has gotten to the Pacific Ocean. No more room to grow. This idea that the frontier is closed implies that there's no more room to expand into greatness. Well, they didn't want to stop that. So the Americans are going to take a look at that and say, well, we can't grow anywhere else on the continent, but we can grow elsewhere outside of the continent. And this is what's going to fuel American imperialism, leading into what we're going to learn about in Unit 4, in places like the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, Hawaii. Okay, so there's always going to be room to expand to keep America growing, being great. We can also see that without the frontier, there's going to be more discontented farmers. Partially this has to do with mechanization. Partially this has to do with machinery, right? This idea that the machines are going to help increase the supply. There's also more farmland that's going to be used for growing crops. So this is the price that they can get, right? Here's demand, here's supply, where they cross, that's where the price point is. But if there's more farm products being made because there's more machinery that can make it easier, that's going to shift that supply curve over here to the right. And if there's more land in production, that's going to shift the supply curve to the right. Demand stays the same, still the same number of people that need the product. So if we shift that the supply curve, that's lowering the price that they're going to get for their farm products. And this is going to lead us into what we're going to learn about in Unit 4, which is the populists.